a mustachioed dictator and father of the people, who started with bank robberies and ended up building camps for his opponents. It was impossible not to joke about it, given that even the name of the main builder of independent Poland is a Polish variation of the name Joseph. Let's put aside the jokes. Joseph Piłsudski is a man who had and still has both fanatical supporters and no less fanatical opponents. This is a man who was not broken by Siberia, and who went from the struggle for independence in the company of hot young socialists to the establishment of his own regime in Poland, which Soviet historiography hastened to brand as fascist in a not particularly legible way. Hello everyone, I am Yegor Ziryanov, and you are on the Redroom channel, where we talk about the dead, and the dead, about history. And today we have a history of wars, revolutions, coup, underground struggle, and even a little bit of love dramas. So sit back, today we are talking about Joseph Piłsudski, a man who spent half his life on a fruitless struggle that bore fruit. Even if not always the ones that were expected of her. The father of the Polish people was born back in 1867 in Lithuania, which was then part of the Russian Empire. The future Polish nationalist, who will then fight with this very Lithuania until he loses his pulse, spent his childhood in the Zulov estate in a large rich gentry family. A funny story, his supporters in the future will associate his origin with the mythical Grand Ducal dynasty of Davsprung. Piłsudski's ally, this seemingly completely wild myth-making in the conditions of the 20th century, will then help to appease the conservatives. They say that we have parliamentarism here, of course, but look, from a monarchical point of view, he's not such a guy. But Piłsudski's opponents will adopt this legend when they accuse our hero of aiding the Germans and espionage. They say that he does not just belong to some ancient legendary dynasty, but exactly who its branches are that fled to Prussia. So there's nothing to be surprised about. But it's far from all this. As a child, Joseph had other problems. He had the opportunity to observe how his family, once one of the richest Polish families, was rapidly impoverishing. There is a temptation to write it off as the participation of Piłsudski's sister Dot in the Polish uprising against the Russian government in his youth, but historians have come to the conclusion that repression there was limited to a ban on holding important positions, but no one took away Piłsudski's property. But he spent money on agricultural machinery, which no one knew how to handle, managed to burn out at the opening of an alcohol production without understanding the technology. And his only successful business project was marriage. Well, the bride's dowry was quickly lowered, plus the Piłsudski's estate suddenly burned down, so that in a matter of years, the giant farm was replaced by a small apartment, and the opening of factories, a half-starved life waiting for bailiffs. Meanwhile, Joseph grew up, and in 1877 year, he entered the Vilna Gymnasium. And these times were not very good for students. After the next Polish uprising, the authorities of the empire began to carry out a particularly harsh Russification. For example, now it was impossible to speak Polish with classmates. Naturally, many students opposed, the gymnasiums and universities were boiling, and in response, of course, harsh repressions followed, and thousands of students were arrested and/or expelled in those years, both in Poland and Lithuania. According to Piłsudski's supporters, it was at this difficult time that he decided to embark on the path of revolutionary struggle. On the other hand, his opponents refute this idea with one simple argument consisting of 3 words. Piłsudski graduated from the gymnasium. Unlike many of his classmates. Well, I mean, if thousands of young men were expelled or arrested, and he wasn't, then apparently he didn't fight so much. Friends, you are probably already thinking about how it would be more profitable to use the upcoming Black Friday, but I would warn you. There is no point in chasing discounts on this day, because consumption is, of course, good, but it is much better to invest your time and money in yourself. For example, into a new profession and skills, with which the skill box will help. More than 500 courses, from design to programming, consisting mainly of practice, feedback, and assistance with employment. All this will help you to master the profession you are interested in from scratch. at least in the creative sphere, at least to enter. You will master the main tools in your chosen field and learn how to apply them, which will be helped by professional speakers from large companies such as IB, MTS and AI, Yandex, Tinkoff and Bieber. And by completing the task from these companies, you will be able to replenish your portfolio with high-quality cases in advance. And most importantly, the Skillbox Career Center will refund your money if you do not get a job at the end of the course. And in order for you to do this, they will help you make a resume, find a vacancy, and prepare for an interview. You can pay for most of the courses in installments, but this is not the only profitable opportunity. Let's say, for example, you will receive the second course as a gift, and no one will take away access to these courses from you. It will remain forever. If you are not sure what kind of profession you want to master, then special managers from Skillbox will help you decide on a special consultation based on your skills and preferences. Smart Black Friday is already on the Skillbox, so invest in yourself with a profit of up to 60%. To do this, click on the link at the bottom of the description or on the code that you see on the screen. However, Piłsudski really could not stand Russians, which he openly expressed from the earliest years. There was also the influence of the rebel father and mother, but more of an objective historical situation. The Russian government suppressed and repressed the Poles, and the reciprocal hatred was quite natural. It is mainly a matter of a serious difference in political institutions. In general, the Western region, Poland with Lithuania, was one of the most developed regions of the empire, and continued to strengthen this status. But the local traditions of self-government, sowing, the liberties of the gentry, these things did not go well with the Russian autocracy. At least most of the time. Add here the violent Russification and the most severe repressions against the Catholic Church, and Piłsudski's position will become clear. By the way, he did not tactfully divide the government and the people, but hated everyone at once, the Russian government, the people and culture. However, in the gymnasium, this hatred was almost not manifested. Piłsudski, of course, participated in the activities of several, mainly socialist circles. But their activities were limited to chatter. Then there was Kharkiv University, then transferred to another university, bureaucratic difficulties with this, and as a result, Piłsudski spent quite a lot of time in Vilna with his family. And there, from his brother Bronislav, he really picked up socialist ideas. He studied in St. Petersburg, and was there in several rather radical cells. On the 22nd of March, 1887, he was arrested. As it turned out, in St. Petersburg, terrorists from Narodnaya Volya decided to kill the Tsar with a poison bomb. Seriously, they planned to lubricate the bomb with poison, so that even a slight wound, if anything, would be fatal for the Tsar. Bronislav was not at the very top of the conspiracy. He knew nothing about these plans, but he was instructed to bring some components of the infernal machine to the capital. The attempt never took place, and several terrorists fell into the hands of gendarmes and surrendered all of them. Arrests swept through the empire, and the Piłsudski brothers were also tied up. Bronislav was first sentenced to death, but then the Tsar pardoned him and replaced the execution with a 15-year exile to Siberia. Only 5 organizers of the assassination attempt were hanged, among whom, by the way, was Alexander Ulyanov. Yes, Lenin's brother. Joseph Piłsudski, in fact, had nothing to show. He did not know about the conspiracy, and was not a member of a terrorist organization. My brother used it in the dark for small errands. However, the gendarmes reasoned that even a small part in the attempt on the Tsar could not be left unpunished. At the trial itself, Joseph was a witness, but the Minister of Justice, who was handed over the case, decided that the fact of acquaintance with the conspirators was enough. So Joseph was sent to Siberia for 5 years without an administrative sentence. There was such a legal opportunity in Russian legislation. This 5-year exile is often presented by biographers as the period of his manhood, when he finally confirmed his decision to embark on the path of revolutionary struggle. However, if you read his letters from the link, then this image breaks down somewhat. On the contrary, he basically writes that all this was some kind of mistake, and he will behave well afterwards. And in general, the future marshal and president at that time most of all wants to become a writer. And he worries that he does not have enough education for this. And all his letters in general were written to different women, one of whom, apparently, he was going to marry on his return from Siberia. However, as often happens, all these sober plans for a quiet family life exist only while you are under punishment. And when Joseph was released in 1892 and returned to Vilna, he again began to go to a meeting of socialists. They were quite harmless before the appearance in Vilna of Maria Yashkevich, a beautiful lady of the Polish underground, the widow of a very rich man who had cover-firmed the Russian administration. She was arrested several times, and she was literally deported to Vilna. There she joined local socialist circles and began to unite them, and began to get involved with Warsaw and all sorts of other foreign socialist movements. Piłsudski immediately joined the fight. No, not revolutionary, but for the Heart of Mary with Roman Dmowski, the future leader of the National Democratic Party of Poland. For the first few decades of independence, these two would wage a fierce political struggle among themselves. But mutual hostility had already begun, as it was believed then in Vilna, with the rivalry for the beautiful lady. Then they will have many other reasons for disagreement, and this will greatly complicate the internal policy of the young Polish state. However, this is still a long way off. In the meantime, thanks to Maria Yashkevich, the Vilna socialists have become part of the Polish Socialist Party, the PP. In addition, Piłsudski wrote notes to the newspaper of the Foreign Union of Polish Socialists, published in London, and took over the organization of all local affairs. He was very lucky. The Secret Service worked tirelessly. Polish socialists left for Siberia one by one, but Joseph, despite his turbulent activity, managed to avoid arrest for almost 10 years. Since places in the leadership were constantly being vacated, and Piłsudski himself was, at least, a talented journalist, his career was going uphill rapidly. In just a year in the PP, he turned from an unknown former exile into one of the leaders of the Polish socialist movement. It is worth saying a few words about this movement, about how Piłsudski understood socialism. The point was that the primary task of the PP was national liberation and social transformations of some kind. This is already, you know, maybe later, not now, let's do it tomorrow. Well, it's certainly not worth overestimating Piłsudski's love for leftist ideas either. He saw the socialist movement first of all as a tool for gaining independence, and only then everything else. And he, let's just say, disliked Marx. Although I read it. However, Piłsudski did not have time for a deep study of the great theorists, because he was deeply immersed in revolutionary practice. This newspaper was printed at a secret printing house, which constantly moved from one shelter to another, and, generally speaking, this period of Piłsudski's life was a time of rather dangerous games with the gendarmerie, but still. He and Maria managed to get married at that time. And here's an interesting fact. She was actually divorced, and they couldn't marry according to the Catholic rite, so they had to marry according to the Protestant one. And it seems to be something like that, but it caused a terrible scandal when in the end the truth about it surfaced. Because Catholicism in Poland is very important. I mean, like, very important. But this will happen later, but in the meantime, there were actually more serious problems. In the 1900th year, the printing house was covered, and the Piłsudskis were arrested. Maria was able to convince the gendarmes that she did not participate in illegal activities, she did not inform her husband. Because of hot feelings for him. 11 months later, she was recognized as a victim of love and released. But it soon became clear to the leader of the Lithuanian PP party that this time he would go to Siberia for decades. So he began to feign insanity, expressed in disgust for the gendarme uniform, and in a hunger strike. He was helped by the director of the Warsaw Hospital for the Insane, by the way, a Russian, who saw through the simulation, but still signed the documents on the transfer of the patient to the St. Petersburg Psychiatric Hospital. A member of the PS worked there as one of the doctors, and one day they escaped from the hospital with a patient. Piłsudski secretly made his way through all of European Russia, crossed the border, and ended up in Galicia. There he moved to London, and then returned to Poland with false documents, and again plunged into underground work. Now he was surrounded by the halo of a hero. Soberly speaking, it was somewhat presumptuous to fight for Poland's independence at that time, because historical Poland was divided between the three largest powers of the region, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Russian Empire. So, as the Poles say, it was like walking with a hoe in the sun. But Piłsudski did not lose hope, remaining one of the leaders of the only Polish movement that advocated armed struggle. Well, soon he saw an opportunity. The Russian-Japanese War began and Piłsudski, through the London socialists, proposed to the Japanese a plan to open a second front in Poland. The Japanese were interested in such a proposal and summoned him to Tokyo, but none. His old enemy Dąbrowski went with Piłsudski, and he explained to the Japanese that there was nothing, frankly, to dream of a general national uprising against the empire, and local protests would quickly be suppressed. The Japanese listened to this opinion and sent Piłsudski back with almost nothing, giving only a little money for his fight. I forgot to say, Piłsudski also proposed to create a Polish legion in the army of the Emperor of Japan, but it turned out that the local constitution forbids this. We have lost so much, friends. And then the revolution of 1905 began, and the party of Polish socialists split. Conditional old men, such as 38-year-old Piłsudski, were for an independent Poland. But the youth, literally from the young faction, were already becoming more interested in socialism and the revolution. Together with the Russian proletariat. After the split, Piłsudski reassembled the rest of his party. Now it has become a completely different combat organization. The first Russian Revolution was still in full swing, and all revolutionary movements were quickly radicalized. The era of expropriations was beginning. Piłsudski's Polish socialists used this method of revolutionary struggle to the fullest. Moreover, the future marshal himself did not go on any raids, but only developed plans. Naturally, accusations of cowardice soon sounded. And it was necessary to lead the attack on the mail train himself in 1908 year, firm where about 200,000 rubles were taken out. This operation, although there were actually a lot of such raids, became a bright smear in the future portrait of the national hero. However, detractors say that its value is greatly overestimated, that the detachments did not advance and retreat in an organized manner, and in general, they took out only part of the money that was claimed. In May 1906, he met in Warsaw with comrade Oleja Alexandra Sherbinskaya, with whom he immediately fell in love. They were engaged in such a romantic business as planning a bank robbery, so it's not surprising. The idea there was funny. It was to get a job as stokers in the boiler room under the bank, and then at night to dig a hole in the floor. However, his previous party comrade Maria refused to give a divorce to her left-wing spouse. And what do you think Piłsudski had to do? Maybe throw tackles to the left-wing revolutionaries. No, he just decided to deal with both women at once. He lived with one family, and the other wrote long romantic letters. Meanwhile, the revolution in Russia has finally run out of steam. Some people rushed to use the political freedoms they had won, and some went to places not so remote. Piłsudski came up with the idea to create a base for anti-Russian activities abroad, and Galicia seemed to be the most attractive option. Fortunately, there were relatively many freedoms in Austria-Hungary, compared to Russia, which was squeezed in a vice. He offered the Austrians to conduct intelligence against Russia, in exchange for arms supplies, loyal attitude to the warehouses of Onov, and, of course, for the absence of repression against the revolutionaries. In 1908 year, the Austrians agreed to such cooperation. They allowed Piłsudski to create his own subversive organization, the Union of Active Struggle. But only 147 people signed up for it in a year, which was a bit shameful. However, Piłsudski was not discouraged, and continued to walk with a hoe in the sun. There is a legend connected with the pre-war period about the genius prophetic gift of the future leader. He said that victory would go from west to east, that the British and French would defeat the Germans, and the Germans would defeat the Russians. And it seems like these words were found half a century later in the diary of some socialist, who heard them from Piłsudski at a Paris meeting, where there were 500 people, and none of them mentioned anything like that. But in fact, it was not necessary to have a prophetic gift at that time to guess that Europe was heading for a big war. Well, it is clear that Piłsudski, who had dreamed of Polish independence all his life, saw in this potential war a chance for the liberation of Poland. In 1910, Piłsudski created already quite legal paramilitary organizations in Austria-Hungary, simultaneously trying to unite all anti-Russian and Polish forces around him. Their joint commission immediately appointed him to the post of chief commandant of all Polish military forces. And soon the commandant entered the war. On the 6th of August, 1914, the arrows assembled by Piłsudski invaded the Polish territory of the Russian Empire. It became immediately clear that the operation was suffering a complete collapse. Contrary to Piłsudski's hopes and the promises he made to the Austrian headquarters, the Poles did not run en masse to enlist in his troops. There was nothing surprising in this. In general, there was nothing. The plan to raise the locals to a mass uprising was clearly a bit damp, and it was all more of a campaign and a minor diversion than a serious invasion. This did not prevent some historians from later extolling this date as dividing Polish history into before and after. However, the fire of delight among contemporaries was quickly extinguished by the malicious Dmowski. After the war, he quite reasonably pointed out that, first, the operation failed, and secondly, and thank God, because if the Polish rebels would have supported Piłsudski, then with probability Germany would very powerful and fast would be defeated Russia, and then would be able to fight on one front. The defeat of France, the Great War would have happened, and Poland would be forever lost the chance to gain independence. Well, a subjunctive story is certainly such a thing, but there really are no reasons to extol this date in fact, in general. Excuse me. Anyway, in the autumn of 1914, Piłsudski, like many others in Europe, had to say goodbye to his great plans. The symbol of radical changes was that in December he shaved off his beard, which he had worn almost all his life, and was left with only a mustache. The retreating riflemen joined the Austrian army, its emerging Polish legion. Piłsudski's brigade was different from all the others. Its fighters tore off the Austrian insignia, disrespected the Austrian officers, and claimed that they were fighting for Poland, not for Austria. By the way, after the February Revolution, Polish legions will also be created in Russia, and they will be commanded by Dawber Mysnicki, a future associate of Piłsudski. At the same time, the Poles fought in the Austrian army conscientiously, well, despite the complete insubordination, so how to look at it? During the Brusilov breakthrough, they were one of the few units of the Austro-Hungarian army that did not run, retreated in an organized manner, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. In 3 days of fighting, Piłsudski's brigade lost 30 officers and about 500 privates. The brigadier wanted a reward from the Austrians for such sacrifices and asked them to help the Poles gain independence. Especially since a year before the Brusilov breakthrough, Warsaw was occupied by the German allies. The German command, having heard about such jokes, hinted to the Austrians that in fact no one needed such commanders in this army. And Piłsudski was generally thrown out of his post. And then he was arrested. The Germans. And it was easy. Great. The imprisonment seemed to negate several years of war for the Austrians and Germans, later. It greatly simplified Piłsudski's understanding with Entente. The term in Megburg prison itself was quite comfortable. Piłsudski occupied 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of a 2-story mansion. In 1918th year, Comrade Olia gave birth to our hero's daughter. And while Piłsudski was walking around his mansion there and suffering, she worked at a vegetable dryer in order to somehow feed herself and the child. He was released only in November of 1918, when the revolution was already raging both in Russia and in Germany. The old world fell apart, and the new one was being created right before our eyes. The Germans released Piłsudski in the hope that his potential future government would be kind to them. Joseph boarded the train and soon got on the platform in Warsaw. I came there to make history. At first there was euphoria. For many years, everyone dreamed of independence, and the era of endless happiness was about to come. But it didn't come. Piłsudski and other Polish politicians began discussing the contours of the future state, and soon they tried to kill him. The conspiracy was organized by members of the National Democratic Party of Indeka, supporters of Dmowski, who, however, himself seemed to be not involved in all this. Meanwhile, he managed to organize his own government in exile in Paris, which also claimed power in Poland. This attempt turned out to be ridiculous. Piłsudski did not arrange any proceedings at all, no investigations. He just called 2 hapless murderers to him, yelled at them, and sent them back to serve. Because both of them, yes, served in the army, and both made a good career under his leadership. The Poles decided to convene their Constituent Assembly 7. Piłsudski, whose popularity increased significantly after the unsuccessful assassination attempt, received dictatorial powers and the task of holding elections. And he led Poland through a turbulent period with an iron hand, and then, as agreed, handed over all power to the same. And it made a favorable impression in the West, and Poland received international recognition. Piłsudski was appointed head of state, to whom the entire executive branch is subordinate, and commander-in-chief of all armed forces, while the other Polish parties were fiercely fighting for parliamentary mandates. Piłsudski was creating a political force of a different kind. It was to be based on the legionnaires who had gone through the war with him. Austrian counterintelligence during the First World War was worried that there was a cult of his personality in the units subordinate to Piłsudski. Well, when his illusory goal of independence was finally achieved, the cult of the brigadier soared to the skies. And many of the legionnaires, of course, did not find themselves in a peaceful life and returned to the army when he called them. Great plans were raging in his head. He saw Poland as a new regional leader, something like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in its heyday. But it was somehow dangerous to look to the west, but it was quite good to look to the east, because in Russia, meanwhile, there was a fierce civil war. So to speak, a great reason to return the ancestral lands. But in fact, of course, one should not overestimate Piłsudski now, or blame him for all the responsibility for Poland of that time. We used to do this with all these mustached guys in uniforms, but Poland was a peculiar place back then. The Polish army of the 19th year was a whole lot of different detachments, controlled, in general, by semi-independent commanders, with whom it was necessary to compromise. They will be put together into a single normal army, consider it only by the 20th year. And so, at the initiative of one of these military leaders, the leader of the Polish self-defense in Lithuania, Piłsudski's forces invaded in the 19th year. To Lithuania, to almost native Vilna. The plan was, apparently, that the Lithuanians would support him, but this did not happen. Of course, his participation in the chaos of the civil war was not limited to this. Soon, Denikin, the famous white general who launched the offensive against Moscow, will ask for help from Piłsudski. However, he not only refused, but also announced his decision to the Reds. They transferred 40,000 people from the Polish front and defeated his troops. By the way, what kind of front? Because there was no war between the Soviets and the Poles then. Well, it didn't go well, but the constant skirmishes on the border reached the limit, and in fact formed a whole front. The Poles even took Minsk. The great point of all these manipulations was that the Reds and Whites would bleed each other dry. And war communism would finish everyone off in Soviet Russia so much at some point that it would fall off with one poke. Like in Worms. In the 20th year, Piłsudski, who, by the way, recognized the independence of Ukraine, began an offensive against Kiev. Together with Petlura. As in Lithuania, the operation was unsuccessful. There were many Ukrainians who wanted to build communism together with their Russian classmates. There were many more who dreamed of an independent state, but there were not enough people willing to change the Russian, all to Polish soap. Of course, both Ukrainian and Russian White Guards eventually fought in Piłsudski's troops, but in general, he did not become a star there. Well, soon the Red Army went on the offensive. And if anyone had a really crazy plan, it was the future Red Marshal Tukhachevsky, who was 27 years old at the time. He, commanding the entire Western Front at that time, issued an order demanding that the fighters of the workers' revolution look to the West, where the fate of the world revolution is being decided, and reported that the path to a world conflagration lies through the corpse of White Poland. Well, according to the classics, it is necessary to bring happiness and peace to the working humanity on bayonets. Quotes. It is still unclear whether it was Tukhachevsky's personal improvisation or Lenin's order. Moreover, at that time everyone in Moscow generally understood that there might not be enough resources for another year of war. And in general, when Tukhachevsky gave this order, the war had actually already been won, and negotiations were underway in Minsk. However, the skirmishes still, in fairness, continued. But it was not won, comrade was not enough, and therefore they eventually lost everything. Yes, because this is the traditional ending for great plans, military defeat, and flight. And in this case, it was Piłsudski who inflicted a military defeat on the Reds. For this victory, a miracle hung over him. He received recognition. The miracle, of course, was amazing from all sides. Tukhachevsky, for example, did not understand at all how many people he had. The Red Army was replenished with forced mobilizations, soldiers deserted, and because of hunger. The commanders overestimated the number of their fighters, well, in order to get more rations. At the same time, the name Miracle loomed was originally invented by Polish opponents of Piłsudski. And the meaning in it was absolutely negative. They say it's a miracle that Piłsudski, who launched his idiotic offensive in Ukraine with small forces, and suffered a terrible defeat there, was able to do something on this Vistula. But Piłsudski was able to, and his popularity among the soldiers skyrocketed. However, there were noticeably fewer worshippers outside the legion. His relations with the Sejm quickly deteriorated, so in 1922, he resigned and went to a country estate to write his memoirs. Do you remember that he dreamed of becoming a writer? However, the situation in the country was getting worse and worse. Hyperinflation was rampant, governments were changing, and the political crisis did not subside. Piłsudski was completely disappointed in the parliament, because what's the deal? They are arguing with each other there, imagine. The fact that the parliament should reflect the whole spectrum of different opinions in one society. But somehow he was not particularly interested in it. He put the cart before the horse and believed that society was split because deputies could not agree among themselves. And not vice versa. Well, not a place for discussion, in short. In 1926 year, therefore, he went, wherever you think, to the capital and seized power. The enterprise was not without difficulties. Hundreds of people died in Warsaw. Piłsudski had a stroke. His now finally wife Alexandra later told that she had seen him in such a deplorable state, then only once more, right before he died. In general, all this is not surprising. Apparently, the coup was largely an improvisation. Only a small part of the garrisons acted on the marshal's side. Well, having made a coup d'état, Piłsudski endowed himself with dictatorial powers and began the so-called policy of rehabilitation. At the same time, the parliament, as well as the positions of the prime minister and the president remained. If it seems to you that this is an amazing victory for democracy, then it seems to you on the whole. The fact is that the appointment of the president and the prime minister, in fact, was in the hands of Piłsudski. But at the same time, the parliament voted against the possibility of self-dissolution. And yes, in fact, I found myself in a situation where, in case of any possible disagreement with the line, so to speak, of the party, I essentially remained helpless. Soon, mainly targeted repressions began and, characteristically, in many respects they were directed against Piłsudski's former supporters, who switched to the opposition. When they realized that, surprise, surprise, he was not going to share power with them. As a matter of fact, most of all former supporters, mainly from left-wing parties, were upset because Piłsudski did not dissolve the parliament, deciding that this ridiculous talk would not only not prevent him from ruling, but would help him at all, and would help him rule legitimately. And yes, it's funny, in general, this whole story with the seizure of power did not seem to anyone, at least in any way, wrong. Piłsudski's power, in fact, was approved by the preserved parliament, so that no one among Western countries expressed anything to him. The USSR grumbled at first, but when he received a promise that the Poles would not fight with him, he also exhaled, and maintained absolutely comfortable relations with Poland until Piłsudski's death. It is ironic that in the end, both the neighbor in the West and the neighbor in the East will not act very neighborly with Poland. Meanwhile, Piłsudski took over the military power, changed the constitution, and significantly expanded the capabilities of the president appointed by him. Now he could actually tell the parliament what to do. Veto, cancel the decision, dissolve this parliament if desired, and so on. In fact, there was such a peculiar, let's call it a proxy dictatorship, where Piłsudski remained a grey cardinal, until his death on May 12, 1935 year. Before his death from cancer, in fact, he managed to make the army the main political body in the country. Condolences on the death of the Marshal were sent by literally everyone, from Stalin and Hitler to the Pope. And independent Poland, for which Piłsudski fought all his life, was soon waiting for new severe shocks. But Poland, as we know, is still strong. So write your comments. What do you think about Comrade Piłsudski, about his throwing, about his relations with the authorities, with Poles and with Russians? It will all be very interesting to read. Well, in any case, subscribe to the channel and like this video if you were interested. And if you want to support this channel, if you want to watch videos with the very first and without integrative advertising, then go to our Busty if you have a Russian card, or to Patreon if you have a foreign card, and support the channel there. We will be very grateful to you. Here, personally, I will express my gratitude to our closed ones in a Telegram, in a chat. See you soon. Well, what else? That's it.